At 68 years old, I sold the company I had built from nothing for $62 million. To celebrate, I took my only son and his wife to the finest restaurant in the city. He raised his glass and smiled, and when he thought no one was watching, he tried to kill me. What my son didn't know was that someone else was watching, and one quiet warning would begin the end of his world. Before I begin this story, please subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where in the world you are listening from. The restaurant was a temple of wealth, the kind of place where every sound was muted, where voices never rose above polite conversation, and where the crystal glasses seemed fragile enough to shatter from a whisper. Across from me, Daniel and Laura played their parts like seasoned actors. Their compliments were smooth, their laughter rehearsed, their eyes never quite meeting mine. "62 million, Dad," Daniel said, shaking his head with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "It's incredible. A lifetime of work, all yours." His hand trembled just slightly as he lifted the glass, but only someone who had spent a lifetime reading people would have noticed. I nodded, raising my cranberry juice, though the sweetness felt poisoned even before I knew the truth, because I knew the cost behind that number: 40 years of missed dinners, grease-stained hands, and long nights wondering if Hale Freight Systems would survive another month. Daniel saw only the millions. He had never seen the sacrifices. Laura leaned closer, her cool hand resting lightly on mine. "Richard, we're so proud of you," she said with practiced warmth. "Now you can finally relax. Let us take care of you." Her words slipped through the air like a knife wrapped in silk. Let us take care of you. Not a promise, not even an offer. A proposal. I looked at Daniel then, searching his eyes for the boy, who once begged to ride along in my old truck, clutching a toy car, laughing when the road jolted us around, but that boy was gone. What sat across from me now was a man with hunger in his eyes, a hunger so sharp it gleamed. I didn't know it yet, but that hunger was about to bare its teeth. The silence in that restaurant was thick, almost sacred. The sound of cutlery against porcelain echoed like church bells in the quiet. It wasn't a place for noise. It was a place for power, for wealth, for people who had never needed to raise their voices to be heard. Across the table, Daniel and Laura smiled too brightly. Their words were polished, like lines from a script rehearsed in the car on the way over. Every laugh, every compliment felt like it had been carefully planned in advance, crafted not to honor me, but to convince me. "You've given your whole life to Hale Freight Systems, Dad," Daniel said, his tone syrupy, but his eyes restless. "And now 62 million. That's legacy money. That's history." Legacy. The word stung, because I knew what legacy meant. Legacy wasn't money. Legacy was the long nights, the calloused hands, the missed birthdays, the grease under my fingernails that never seemed to wash out. Legacy was the truck I drove alone, the contracts I negotiated with men who wanted to crush me, and the company I carved out of my own bones. Daniel didn't see any of that. He saw the millions, only the millions. Laura tilted her head, her smile soft, her voice dripping with admiration that felt painted on. "Richard, really, now you can let go of the weight, rest, enjoy what you've earned. You deserve to just be taken care of." Her words clung to me. "Let us take care of you." I'd heard that phrase before, years earlier, spoken with a different kind of warning. My wife Margaret, may she rest in peace, had seen through Daniel long before I ever dared to. She used to tell me he didn't see me as a father, but as a bank. I can still picture her standing by the window after one of his many requests for money, her eyes dimmed with sorrow. "Be careful, Richard," she had whispered. "He's not looking at you. He's looking at what you can give him." At the time, I brushed it off as her being too harsh. I wanted to believe the best in my son. I wanted to believe love was stronger than greed. But sitting in that room, listening to Laura's voice like silk stretched over steel, Margaret's words came back to me like a prophecy. The conversation drifted into shallow waters. They asked about my health but didn't wait for my answer. They spoke of their future plans, a trip to Europe, a new car, all with the quiet assumption that the fortune I had earned was already theirs to spend. I watched them carefully, every gesture, every flicker of their expressions. I had hoped for real joy, real pride, but all I saw was hunger, barely disguised, waiting for the right moment to bare its teeth, and that moment was coming faster than I realized. As Daniel's voice droned on about trips abroad and new cars, my mind drifted away from the table, back to where it had all begun. Hale Freight Systems hadn't always been worth millions. It had started with one truck, one battered second-hand truck that rattled and coughed like an old man trying to breathe. I was 28 years old then, younger than Daniel is now, with nothing in my pockets but grit and a belief that I could carve out something better than the hand I'd been dealt. I remember nights when the radiator hissed steam into the freezing air while I sat inside with frozen fingers, scribbling numbers on a notepad, trying to figure out how to stretch the week's fuel money far enough to make every delivery. I remember the ache in my back after unloading shipments alone at midnight, the calluses on my hands that never seemed to heal. I remember Margaret waiting up for me, a plate of cold dinner on the table, her eyes filled with both pride and worry. Those years weren't glamorous. They weren't the kind of story you tell to impress anyone. They were raw survival. Contracts won one handshake at a time. Clients convinced not by promises, but by me showing up at dawn, reliable when no one else was. And slowly, painfully, that one truck became 2, then 5, then a fleet. Warehouses rose where empty lots once stood. What started with grit grew into something undeniable. That was legacy, the kind of legacy no dollar figure could capture. But when I looked across the table, I saw none of that in Daniel's eyes. He had never known the hollow ache of hunger while bills piled up. He had never stared at a broken-down truck and wondered if failure was about to consume everything you'd built. What he saw was a number, 62 million. To him it wasn't decades of sacrifice or proof of survival. It was a jackpot, a prize that belonged to him simply because he bore my name. Laura leaned closer to him, her eyes glinting with the same quiet calculation. They talked about houses, about a new life in places they'd never worked to deserve. They spoke as though their future had already been purchased, written in stone. I took a slow sip of my cranberry juice and studied them. Their smiles were polished. Their admiration was a performance, but I could feel the emptiness behind it. For years I had bailed Daniel out, paid off his gambling debts, helped with mortgages that were always too big for him to handle, co-signed loans he promised to repay, but never did. I had told myself it was love, that a father's job was to protect his child from the worst of the world. But sitting there, I realized what Margaret had always known. Protection had turned into indulgence. Love had turned into enabling. And what sat across from me wasn't a grateful son. It was a man who had been sharpened into something cold and entitled by the very generosity I thought would save him. And soon I would see just how far that entitlement had driven him. Laura's hand lingered on mine for a moment too long, her smile unwavering. "Now you can finally enjoy life, Richard," she said softly, her tone dripping with false affection. "You've earned the right to step back. Let us take care of everything for you." The phrase struck me again, sharper this time. "Let us take care of you." It didn't sound like comfort. It sounded like a sentence. Daniel suddenly stood, his smile widening as he extended a hand toward his wife. "Laura, my love," he said with a theatrical flourish. "They're playing our song. Dance with me." She blushed on cue, tilting her head just enough to look delicate as she took his hand. Together they glided toward the small dance floor near the grand piano. Their bodies swayed in rhythm to the slow ballad, her head resting briefly on his shoulder, his hand on her waist. From a distance they looked like the perfect couple, two young people in love, celebrating with a proud father. But I knew better. I had seen behind the curtain too many times to be fooled by the show. I remembered the quiet phone calls when Daniel's gambling debts piled high enough to attract the wrong kind of attention. I remembered signing the checks that erased those debts before men with broken noses and heavy fists came knocking. I remembered the mortgage I had co-signed for the sprawling house they now flaunted, a house that bled money they never had. They had cars that gleamed in the driveway, vacations splashed across social media, designer clothes that seemed to appear in Laura's closet overnight. From the outside, their life was flawless. But I knew the truth. Their picture-perfect world was a fragile illusion, built entirely on my back, held together by my money. I turned back to my drink, swirling the cranberry juice in my glass. My doctor had been firm after my last checkup. No more whiskey. My heart was strong, but not invincible. "Cranberry juice," he said, "a small sacrifice for a longer life." I had accepted it, thinking it was a choice I made for myself. But staring into the deep red liquid, I had no idea it had already been turned into something else entirely. The music swelled as Daniel twirled Laura in a graceful spin, both of them laughing as though nothing in the world could touch them. I watched them carefully, and for the first time, I wondered if their laughter was meant for me at all. I had come to this dinner hoping for pride, hoping for respect. Instead, what I saw was a performance designed to mask greed, and though I didn't know it yet, the act was about to shatter. That's when I noticed him. A man in a pressed security guard uniform making his way across the restaurant with deliberate steps. He was older, perhaps in his early 60s, but his posture was rigid, straight as steel, his eyes sharp and unblinking. He didn't move like a waiter or a guest. He moved like someone with a purpose. He stopped beside my table and bent slightly at the waist, lowering his voice so only I could hear. His name tag read Samuel. His expression was professional, but beneath it I caught the faint glimmer of genuine concern. "Mr. Hale," he said quietly, his tone steady but urgent, "I don't mean to alarm you, but when your son came back from the bar a few minutes ago, I saw something. He thought no one was watching. I saw him pour something into your glass." For a moment the world stopped moving. The notes from the piano disappeared. The clinking of cutlery faded into silence. All I could hear was the heavy, frantic pounding of my heart. I stared at him, my mind fighting against the words, searching for any possibility that I had misheard. But Samuel's eyes held mine, and there was no mistaking the truth in them. He wasn't a man fishing for attention. He wasn't mistaken. He had seen what he said he had seen. My hand tightened around the stem of my glass. The deep red liquid that had once been a symbol of health, of sacrifice, now looked like a pool of poison. Years of negotiating contracts and handling crises had taught me contra. Oh! My instinct screamed to leap from my chair, to throw the glass across the room, to confront Daniel in front of everyone. But I forced myself still. I swallowed down the shock and gave Samuel the smallest of nods, almost imperceptible, a silent confirmation that I had heard and understood. He straightened, touched the brim of his cap as though nothing had happened, and walked away, fading back into the quiet shadows of the restaurant. My thoughts raced in a storm of fragments. Daniel's impatience, his probing questions about my will, his frustration when I told him I expected to live another 20 years. Suddenly it all connected. He wasn't just greedy. He wasn't just entitled. He was willing to erase me from the world to get what he wanted. I looked at the dance floor. My son was smiling, spinning Laura around in his arms, his face glowing with laughter. He looked so ordinary, so normal, the picture of happiness, and yet the glass beside me was a death sentence, placed there by his own hand. The betrayal was so complete, so unnatural, that my breath caught in my chest. My son, my only child, had just tried to murder me. And in that moment, I knew nothing in my life would ever be the same again. I forced myself to breathe evenly as Samuel's words echoed in my mind. My fingers brushed the cool glass of cranberry juice sitting in front of me. To anyone else it looked harmless, refreshing even, but to me it was a loaded gun waiting to fire. My son's gun. The music drifted to a close. Daniel and Laura returned to the table, their cheeks flushed with laughter, their smiles wide, their act flawless. They looked like a couple glowing with joy, and yet only minutes earlier Daniel had tried to hand me death in a glass. I pressed a hand to my stomach, letting out a soft groan. Laura gasped, her eyes widening in a show of concern. "Richard, are you all right?" she asked, her tone too polished, too theatrical. Daniel chuckled nervously. "Dad, your acting's terrible. You'll scare the waiter." I shook my head slowly, forcing a weak rasp into my voice. "No, it's not a joke. My stomach just seized up. An old problem. I think I need to lie down." Laura leaned closer, her hand fluttering toward my arm. "Do you need a doctor? We'll drive you home." I waved them off quickly. I couldn't let them near me. No, it'll pass. I've already called a car. It's waiting outside." Daniel stood, his hand gripping my arm. Even his touch felt poisonous now, like a brand searing into my skin. "Are you sure, Dad? We don't mind." "I'm sure," I said firmly. I steadied myself against the table, and in that moment my hand brushed against the tall glass of cranberry juice. With a motion that looked clumsy but was calculated to the second, I tipped it over. The liquid spread across the pristine white tablecloth, dark red bleeding into the fabric like spilled blood. "Oh, clumsy me," I muttered, feigning embarrassment. While Laura called for a waiter and Daniel fussed over napkins, I moved quickly. I grabbed one of the thick cloth napkins already soaking with the juice. To them it looked like I was wiping my trousers. But in truth, I folded it carefully, slipping the heavy, damp fabric into the inside pocket of my coat. My only proof. My heart pounded as I straightened up. "I'll be fine," I murmured. "Just need rest." They were distracted, still fussies, laying over the mess. I didn't wait for another word. I turned and walked out, my legs trembling, but steady enough to carry me through the doorway. 15 minutes later, I was in the back seat of a silent car, the city lights blurring past the window like streaks of fire. My hand never left my pocket, clutching the soaked napkin. The sickly sweet smell of cranberry clung to me, heavy and suffocating. I should have felt anger. I should have felt grief. But in that moment, all I felt was clarity. Daniel had set a trap for me tonight, but by walking away with that napkin, I had turned the trap on him. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The car slowed near my neighborhood, but I didn't ask the driver to stop. My house was just a few streets away, its windows glowing with the warm light of familiarity, but I couldn't go there, not yet. Home was filled with memories, with photographs of Margaret smiling in frames, with the ghosts of birthdays and family dinners. To walk inside now would be to collapse under the weight of grief, and grief was a luxury I couldn't afford, not when survival depended on clarity. "Keep driving," I said quietly. The driver glanced at me in the rearview mirror, but didn't ask questions. I directed him toward the heart of the city, to a building I remembered from years ago. Hale Freight Systems had once contracted with a private diagnostic lab there for employee drug testing. I knew the place operated around the clock, discreet, efficient, and most importantly, silent. The kind of place where the wealthy could confirm their worst fears without leaving a trace in the public record. The glass doors slid open with a hiss, and I stepped into the lobby. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and ozone, sharp and clinical. Behind a pane of glass sat a young technician, his face bathed in the glow of a computer monitor. His name tag read David. He looked up, his expression neutral, professional. I pulled the folded napkin from my coat pocket. The fabric was heavy with moisture, sealed hastily in a plastic bag I'd taken from a trash bin outside the diner where the car had dropped me. I slid it into the tray beneath the glass. My voice was calm, too calm for the storm raging inside me. "I need a full toxicology screening on this, comprehensive, organic and inorganic, tonight." David examined the bag without flinching, then nodded. "Priority 1 results in 3 to 4 hours. It will be expensive." "Money isn't an issue," I replied, already reaching for my wallet. I handed over my card without hesitation. He processed the payment and slid a form toward me. "I'll need a contact email for the encrypted report." I scrawled my private address across the line and pushed the form back. My signature looked steady, but my hand trembled as I lowered the pen. "There's a waiting area," David offered, gesturing to a row of chairs. But I couldn't sit. I couldn't be still. "I'll be nearby," I said, turning to leave. The night air hit me like a slap, cool and sharp. A diner glowed at the corner, neon lights buzzing faintly. I stepped inside, ordered a black coffee I had no intention of drinking, and slid into a booth by the window. Outside, the city pulsed with indifferent life. Sirens in the distance, cars rushing past, strangers moving with purpose. Inside, I clutched the knowledge that somewhere in a sterile lab, a machine was working to tell me the truth, and I already knew the truth would change everything. The coffee in front of me had gone cold, untouched. My eyes stayed fixed on the street outside, though I wasn't really seeing anything. The city moved as it always did, indifferent to the storm unraveling inside me. I checked my phone every few minutes, the silence between each glance stretching longer than I thought I could bear. At last, a vibration broke through. My phone buzzed against the tabletop, the screen glowing with an email notification. The subject line was sterile, a string of numbers, and a case file ID. My breath caught in my throat as I opened it. The report loaded, page after page of chemical jargon and measurements, but at the very top, written in plain English for the client, was a summary. My eyes scanned the words, and with each sentence, the truth crystallized. Substance detected, metoprolol tartrate, concentration, 2,500 milligrams per 100 milliliters. The clinical note followed in bold, as though to remove any room for doubt. Metoprolol is a beta blocker commonly prescribed for cardiovascular conditions. The standard therapeutic dosage is between 25 to 100 millimoles. The concentration detected is exponentially higher. Ingestion would almost certainly induce acute myocardial infarction in a patient with pre-existing cardiac conditions. Symptoms would mimic a naturally occurring fatal heart attack. I stared at the screen, the words blurring before my eyes. A heart attack. That's how it would have looked. A tragic, believable death. The aging businessman, gone suddenly, but not unexpectedly. The grieving son by his side, speaking of my legacy with tears in his eyes. A fortune quietly passed down. It was perfect. Too perfect. The diner's neon light flickered against the glass as I leaned back in the booth, the phone trembling in my hand. A small part of me had clung to the desperate hope that this was all some terrible mistake, that Samuel had misinterpreted, that maybe Daniel had spilled something harmless near my glass. But that hope was gone now, erased by hard numbers and cold science. What I held wasn't just a report. It was my death certificate, written in advance by my son's hand. I should have felt rage. I should have wanted to slam my fist against the table, to scream into the night. But instead, I felt something colder, sharper, a calm so profound it frightened me. Daniel hadn't acted out of anger. He hadn't made an impulsive decision. He had studied, prepared, chosen his weapon with precision. He had built a plan not to fight me, but to erase me. And tonight he had tried to execute it with a smile on his face. The poison in my glass wasn't just medicine turned deadly, it was proof that my son had crossed the line between greed and monstrosity. I closed the file, slid the phone onto the table, and stared at my reflection in the darkened window. My son had tried to murder me, and now I knew exactly what I had to do. The sky outside the diner was beginning to pale, the first threads of dawn softening the city's sharp edges. I sat there motionless, staring at my phone, knowing there was only one person I could call. Not the police, not a doctor. Someone I trusted more than anyone still alive. Someone who had been by my side for decades, through storms and triumphs alike. I scrolled through my contacts until I found her name, Eleanor Brooks, my lawyer, my confidant, the daughter of my oldest friend and business partner. She was family in every way that mattered, forged not by blood, but by loyalty and time. My finger hovered for a moment, then pressed call. The line rang twice before her voice came through, sharp and alert despite the early hour. Brooks? Eleanor, I said, my voice low. It's Richard. I need to see you. Now. There was no hesitation, no fumbling questions, only a pause. Then, my office, 30 minutes, and the line went dead. I paid for the coffee I hadn't touched and walked back into the morning air. The city was quiet, still shaking off the night. By the time I reached the steel and glass tower that held Eleanor's office, the sun had just begun to rise, painting the skyline in shades of bruised purple and gold. The lobby was empty except for a lone guard. I stepped into the private elevator, swiped the keycard Eleanor had given me years ago, and rose in silence. The doors opened directly into her office. She was standing by the window, a mug of coffee in her hand, her silhouette outlined against the awakening city. Eleanor was in her late 40s, with the same sharp gaze her father once had, the kind of eyes that seemed to strip lies down to their bones. She turned as I entered, studying my face. "Richard," she said quietly, "you look like you've been through a war." "The war," I replied, my voice hollow, "is only just beginning." I sank into the leather chair opposite her desk, my body heavy with exhaustion but fueled by a cold, steady resolve. And then I told her everything. I described the dinner, the fake smiles, the empty words, the stage performance. I recounted Samuel's warning, his quiet voice at my ear. I slid my phone across the polished wood, the toxicology report open on the screen. Eleanor picked it up, scanned the words. Her jaw tightened, her knuckles whitening around the phone. She placed it down with deliberate care and looked at me. In her eyes I saw not only the outrage of a lawyer, but the fury of someone who had known me and Margaret and what we had built all her life. Her voice was low, dangerous. "That son of a bitch," she whispered. "He finally did it. He crossed the line. And just like that, I wasn't alone anymore." Eleanor set the phone down gently, though the fury in her eyes was anything but gentle. She began pacing, her heels clicking softly against the polished wood floor. "All right," she said, her voice sharp with urgency. "First thing, I'll call the district attorney. We'll have a warrant drafted for Daniel's arrest before breakfast. Attempted murder, premeditated, with Samuel's testimony and this toxicology report. It's an open and shut case." I raised a hand. "No." She froze mid-step, turning to face me. "Richard, he tried to kill you. This isn't theft or fraud. This is murder. He doesn't get to walk free because you're worried about appearances." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, my voice steady but cold. "And what happens when you make that call? Headlines, endless coverage. Hale freight founder poisoned by his own son. My name dragged through the mud for months, maybe years. Every sacrifice I made, every memory of Margaret and me, turned into fodder for tabloids and talk shows. Is that justice, Eleanor? Is that what Margaret would have wanted? For her legacy to rot on a supermarket magazine rack?" She was silent for a long moment, Her sharp eyes locked on mine. She knew me well enough to understand that this wasn't fear speaking. It was resolve. "You don't want justice," she said finally. Her tone softened, almost mournful. "You want something else?" "This isn't about punishment," I said. "Prison is too easy. He wanted 62 million. He wanted power, comfort, freedom bought with my death. I'm going to take all of it away. Not just the money, his entire world. I'll strip him bare, until he has nothing left but the choices he made. Until the greed he worshipped turns into the grave he dug for himself." A slow, dangerous smile spread across her face, one I recognized. It was the same expression her father used to wear before outmaneuvering a rival in the early days of the company. "You don't want a trial," she murmured. "You want demolition." "Exactly." She crossed the room and stood behind her desk, her posture shifting from fury to calculation. "Then we do this my way. Quiet. Surgical. If we're going to dismantle him, we need more than this lab report. We need his debts, his secrets, his weak spots. We need to know every lever we can pull, every crack we can widen. No courtroom drama, just pressure, relentless and invisible, until he collapses under it." I nodded once. "Do it." Eleanor reached for her laptop, her fingers already flying across the keys. "I know a firm, ex-FBI agents, former IRS. They can dig into Daniel and Laura's lives so deeply, they'll know what brand of toothpaste they use. I'll have them on the case by sunrise. Within a week, we'll have a full dossier." I leaned back, exhaling slowly. For the first time since Samuel whispered the warning, I felt steady. I wasn't powerless. I wasn't cornered. Daniel had set his trap for me, but with Eleanor by my side, I was going to turn it into a noose for him. They moved fast. By dawn, Eleanor had a team assembled. 2 former FBI agents who now ran as private investigators, and a retired IRS forensic analyst who smelled debt the way a hound smells blood. They worked like surgeons, quiet and exact, carving into the superficial life Daniel and Laura showed the W, oiled until the rot underneath bled out onto the table. Eleanor briefed them in a room that smelled of fresh coffee and leather, her voice low and efficient as she outlined what we needed: full financials, credit lines, loan agreements, recent wire transfers, any private lenders with short fuses, and a record of weekend spending that didn't match declared income. She wanted bank statements, card slips, the tiny invoices that proved a life lived beyond means. She wanted witnesses, friends who could be asked pointed questions until their casual comments became confessions. While they began to dig, I began to act. In the hours after we left her office, I stepped back into the part I would play for the next week, the frail, grateful father who had survived a horrific scare. I practiced my voice until the thin tremble sounded believable, practiced the pauses and the sighs that would make Daniel think he'd almost lost his prize. The plan was simple but delicate. Let them believe the plan had nearly succeeded. Let their guard fall with relief and drunken hope. Greed makes people careless. Careless people leave footprints. I returned a handful of calls, each one perfectly measured, my voice hoarse from worry, grateful for friends who called to offer sympathy, terse with business partners who wanted reassurance. I posted a carefully curated photo on the company's private channel, a smiling, subdued picture of me with a cup of tea and a short note about taking time to rest. It was all theater, but theater paid in time. Time the investigators would use to pull apart ledgers and track down the lenders who tolerated late payments and threats. Eleanor's team sent updates, small, precise, clinical details that landed like stones in my stomach. A leased Porsche with payments missed, a second mortgage taken out against the house I had given them, 3 high-interest personal loans from private lenders, a chain of credit cards that explained the illusion of a life lived on demand. Each item in their report made the scene at the restaurant crisper, the practiced smiles, the insistence on being taken care of, the casual way they had already begun to spend money they hadn't earned. I read the reports over and over, letting the numbers harden my resolve. The investigators also began to trawl through social circles. They planted a discreet conversation with a gallery assistant who'd been coaxed into revealing that Laura had been asking about private sales and discreet valuations. Someone had been cataloging Margaret's collection, photographing canvases under the pretext of helping with inventory. The thought of that small, tender life, my wife's brushes, her marks of recovery and joy, being itemized like stock hit me harder than any ledger. Every discovery gave me leverage. Every detail became a tool in the slow demolition we were building. But for the plan to work, Daniel needed to feel safe. He needed to believe his attempt had been close to succeeding and that the prize was still within reach. So, I poured my performance into every call, every message, every weary sigh, and let the trap tighten around them without them even knowing. The office was quiet, except for the soft tapping of Eleanor's fingers on her laptop keys. Her team was already in motion, but the silence between us was thick with unspoken truths. I leaned back in the chair, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of years pressing down. "You know," Eleanor said suddenly, her eyes still on the screen, "I've been thinking about something. I must have been 10 or 11. My dad had brought me to your house one evening. You and he had spread blueprints across the living room floor. I remember the two of you so alive, so animated, like two generals plotting the battle that would become hail freight. But what I remember most wasn't you or my father. It was Daniel." Her voice dropped lower, more deliberate. "He was sitting in the corner with one of his toys, a little action figure. While you two were building dreams, he was methodically snapping off its arms one by one. No expression, just breaking it, piece by piece, because he was bored." The memory struck me like a blow. I could see it clearly now. The boy in the corner, eyes empty, hands busy with destruction. Back then I had laughed it off. Children break toys, I told myself. Boys are rough. He'll grow out of it. But sitting in Eleanor's office years later, I realized that was the first warning sign. Not a game, a pattern. "Margaret saw it," I whispered. My throat tightened at the thought of her. "She told me more than once. He doesn't build, Richard. He only takes." I didn't want to believe her. Eleanor closed her laptop and looked at me with eyes that had softened, though the steel beneath them remained. "You gave him everything you could, but sometimes giving just sharpens the knife they turn on you." I stared out the window at the city below, cars moving like tiny sparks in the early light. I thought I was teaching him responsibility. All I taught him was entitlement. Every debt I paid, every mess I cleaned up, it didn't save him. It ruined him. Eleanor leaned forward, her elbows on the desk, her voice low and steady. "Which is why we're not going to save him this time. We're going to let him face what he's built, and we'll do it on your terms, not his." I nodded slowly. The memory of Daniel breaking that toy lingered in my mind, the image of little plastic arms scattered across the carpet. It was a small omen, one I had ignored for too long. Now, years later, the pieces he had broken weren't toys. They were lives. Mine, Margaret's, and soon, his own. The phone rang the next morning, just as I sat in my study with a cup of black coffee. The caller ID flashed Daniel's name. I let it ring 4 times before answering, long enough to make him wonder if I would pick up at all. "Hello," I said, letting my voice sound weaker than it truly was. "Dad!" Daniel's voice burst through the receiver, thick with manufactured worry. "Oh, thank God you answered. We didn't sleep a wink last night. Laura and I kept calling, but it went straight to voicemail. Are you all right? Did you go to the hospital? What happened?" His words tumbled out too quickly, one on top of the other. Not questions of love, but probes for information. Was I alive? Did I suspect? Did his plan fail? I could hear the panic beneath, the practiced tone, like a violin string pulled too tight. I chuckled softly, brushing false reassurance into my words. "Easy, son. I'm fine. Just had a bit of a scare." "What kind of scare?" His voice sharpened, the edge cutting through the feigned concern. My stomach seized up after dinner. It felt serious at first, pressure in the chest, shortness of breath, but the doctor says it was indigestion, too much rich food, too late in the evening. He ran some tests. My heart is fine. I let the lie linger, waited for the silence on the other end. Then I heard it, a slow exhale of relief. His gamble hadn't been discovered. He thought he was safe. "Indigestion?" he repeated, almost incredulous. "That's all?" "That's all," I said with a practiced sigh, the kind of weary sound that suggested the weight of age pressing down. "But it got me thinking, Daniel. You reach my age, and you realize time isn't guaranteed. Legacy becomes important." The line went still. His silence wasn't the quiet of empathy. It was the hush of greed sharpening its ears. "What do you mean, Dad?" "I spoke with Eleanor this morning," I said deliberately, letting the name of my lawyer hang in the air like a gavel. "We've been discussing my estate. That 62 million changes things, complicates them, and I don't want confusion or conflict after I'm gone." Another pause, then his voice, soft but electric with anticipation. "Of course, that makes sense. I've decided the best way is to establish a family trust, a large one, something that will ensure you and Laura are taken care of, something that will protect this money for generations." For 5 full seconds, the line was silent. I could almost hear his heartbeat. When he finally spoke, his voice trembled with eagerness, poorly disguised as humility. "Dad, that's incredible. You don't have to do that. We'll be fine." I smiled into the phone, though he couldn't see it. "Nonsense. You're my only son. Who else would I do it for?" And just like that, the hook was set. The first report came 3 days later. Eleanor forwarded it to me with a subject line that read only one word: report. I opened the encrypted file in my study, my hands steady though my chest tightened with each click. It wasn't a report. It was an autopsy of Daniel and Laura's lives. Total unsecured debt, $3.1 million. I stared at the number until it blurred on the screen. It was spread across a dizzying collection of credit cards, each maxed to the limit: American Express, Visa, platinum lines with minimum payments they hadn't made in months. The itemized statements told a story clearer than any confession. 5-star hotels in the Caribbean, a $12,000 shopping spree in Milan. Jewelry, designer clothes, luxury dinners, one evening at a Manhattan steakhouse that cost more than my first truck. The illusion of success bought on borrowed time. And then the cars. A leased Porsche Cayenne for her, a BMW M5 for him, both behind on payments. Repossession notices already in motion. The house I had given them a down payment for, what was meant to be a foundation for a family, was bleeding too. They had taken out a second mortgage 2 years ago, draining what equity remained. Now they were 90 days delinquent on both loans. Foreclosure wasn't looming. It was already knocking on the door. And it wasn't just banks. Buried in the file were a series of personal loans, high interest, private lenders. The kind who don't send polite letters when you miss a payment. The kind who collect in other ways. $500,000 owed to men whose names were redacted, but whose reputations needed no explanation. The report's summary was merciless. Their assets are illusions. Their lifestyle is unsustainable. They are drowning, desperate for rescue. Without immediate access to substantial capital, collapse is imminent. I leaned back in my chair, the leather creaking beneath me. For weeks I had imagined Daniel's motive was greed, the simple hunger of a spoiled child unwilling to wait for his inheritance. But staring at those numbers, I understood the truth. It wasn't just greed, it was desperation. Daniel and Laura weren't trying to get rich. They were trying to survive. The $62 million wasn't a windfall in their eyes. It was a lifeline, a way out of the pit they had dug with their own reckless hands. That realization didn't soften me. It hardened me. Because desperation makes people dangerous, and the proof was already in my pocket. The stained napkin, the toxicology report. My son had turned survival into an excuse for murder, and now his debts would become the very rope with which I'd hang him. The second report landed 4 days later. Eleanor's email carried a single word in the subject line: update. I opened it expecting more figures, more debts, more proof of Daniel's recklessness, but what I found was something far worse. The file wasn't filled with ledgers or spreadsheets. It was a series of transcripts, field notes, and summaries from calls Eleanor's investigators had intercepted. My eyes caught a familiar name in bold: Laura Hale. The transcript read like a dagger. She had called several high-end art galleries in New York and Boston. Her voice, described by the investigator, was cultured and somber, dripping with carefully rehearsed grief. She introduced herself as the daughter-in-law of Richard Hale, founder of Hale Freight Systems. She explained that her father-in-law's health had taken a serious turn, and that he was on his way out. On his way out. I froze, rereading those words. She spoke about me as though I were already a ghost. My death not a tragedy, but an opportunity. She told them she was handling the disposition of a collection of post-war American paintings, supposedly Margaret's private legacy. She offered high-resolution photographs, taken secretly during her visits to my home, of canvases Margaret and I had chosen together. The investigators even confirmed the metadata on the photos. They had been taken in my study, in my living room, in the halls of my home where Margaret's memory still lived in color and brushstroke. Laura wasn't cataloging family history when she wandered the house, asking about my health and fluffing pillows with a sweet smile. She was casing the place, snapping pictures of my wife's soul so she could sell it off to strangers before my body was even cold. I set the report down and turned toward the wall of my study. Hanging there was the first painting Margaret and I ever bought, a small landscape we had scraped, together 5 payments to afford. She had called it our window to the world we wanted to build. My eyes drifted to another canvas, chaotic swirls of blue and orange. Margaret had chosen the day she was declared cancer-free. "This is what recovery feels like," she had whispered, tears on her cheeks as she held my hand. And finally, the last painting she bought before the sickness returned. A calm seascape, soft and endless, which she said felt like coming home. To Laura, these weren't memories. They weren't love stories written in color and light. They were dollar signs, quick cash to cover debts. My chest tightened until I could barely breathe. The betrayal of my money was one thing. The betrayal of Margaret's memory was another. Daniel had tried to kill me for my fortune. Laura had tried to erase my wife for her collection. This wasn't just greed. This was desecration. And it lit a fire in me colder and sharper than rage. I sat alone in my study long after reading the report, the silence pressing in like a weight. The paintings around me glowed in the dim light, each one a fragment of Margaret's soul. They were not commodities, they were stories, markers of our life together, proof that beauty could survive even in the hardest years. I remembered the way she used to linger in front of the small landscape we bought when we were newly married. Money was scarce back then, but she insisted. "This is our window," she said softly, "to the life we'll build." I could still see the light in her eyes when she hung it on the wall of our tiny apartment, her belief stronger than my doubts. Decades later, after her first brutal battle with cancer, she found an abstract piece at a gallery, violent swirls of blue crashing into fiery orange. She stood before it for hours, her hand tight in mine. "This is what recovery feels like," she whispered. "A mess, but a beautiful one." And then the seascape, the last painting she bought. Calm waters, endless sky. She said it felt like peace, like coming home. I used to catch her sitting across from it, just breathing, just watching. Now it hung opposite my desk, and when I looked at it tonight, it felt different. It felt like a vow I hadn't realized I'd made, to protect it, to protect her memory. Laura had walked through these rooms smiling, asking me if I needed tea, touching my shoulder like she cared. All the while, her eyes had been cataloging, her phone clicking in the shadows. She hadn't come to care for a father-in-law. She had come to appraise the merchandise, to turn Margaret's legacy into auction lots. The thought made my hands tremble. They weren't just trying to strip me of my life. They were preparing to sell hers too. The love she poured into each canvas, the milestones captured in brushstroke and pigment, they saw none of it, only price tags. And Daniel? He had known. He had stood by while Laura whispered into phone lines, while she described Margaret's collection as assets, while she told strangers I was on my way out. He had allowed his wife to circle like a vulture, dismantling his mother's spirit for cash. That betrayal cut deeper than any poisoned drink. My son hadn't just tried to kill me. He had betrayed his own mother's memory. For the first time since this began, I felt something white-hot burning in my chest. Not shock, not sadness, fury, a sacred kind of fury. This wasn't just a personal war anymore. This was a defense of Margaret's soul. And I swore then that they would never touch it, not with their greed, not with their lies, not ever. The third report arrived the following evening. I opened the file expecting more financial rot, another ledger of debts stacked higher than lies, but what I found waiting made my blood run cold. The first page was a clean, high-resolution scan of a legal document, a medical power of attorney. My name was printed neatly at the top, and at the bottom, in bold ink, was my signature, except it wasn't mine. I know my signature the way a soldier knows the weight of his rifle. I've signed everything from million-dollar contracts to birthday cards for Daniel as a boy. The curve of the R, the sharp slash of the H, the way my pen lifts at the end, it's as familiar to me as my own reflection. The one on this page was close, frighteningly close, but it was an imitation, a forgery so precise it might have fooled anyone else, but not me. The investigator's notes below the image were short and merciless. Filed at Northwood General Hospital 3 months ago. 3 months. Long before the company sale. Long before the toast at the restaurant. He had been planning this for months. The report continued with records from the hospital's database. Using that forged authority, Daniel had accessed everything. My entire medical history, stress tests, prescriptions, allergies, every vulnerability that doctors guarded to keep me alive. He hadn't guessed or gambled. He had studied me, my body, my weaknesses, my life distilled into data points on a screen. But the investigators hadn't stopped there. They followed the digital trail outward into library computers, burner phones, search histories traced back to Daniel himself. And what they found was a blueprint of my death, written in cold, clinical searches. How to obtain medical records of a parent. Fast-acting drugs that mimic heart attacks. Tasteless beta blockers. Lethal dosage for 200-planor male with cardiac history. Will an autopsy detect metoprolol overdose? Each search was a nail in the coffin he had prepared for me. He had studied the science of my end the way I once studied supply routes and contracts, not with passion, not with love, with calculation, with precision. I leaned back in my chair, the report trembling in my hands, and for the first time I saw the entire monstrous scope. This wasn't a son losing patience. This wasn't greed in a moment of weakness. This was premeditated, layered, clinical. My life had been reduced to variables in an equation he intended to solve with poison. The intimacy of it broke something inside me. A son is meant to protect his father in old age, not weaponize his heart against him. The bond between us, whatever thread of hope remained, snapped clean. He wasn't my son anymore. He was a predator, and predators don't stop until you put them down. I read those searches again and again, the words burning themselves into my mind. How to fake a natura, death. How to mimic a heart attack. Will an autopsy detect it? There was no room for doubt anymore, no room for excuses. My son hadn't simply wanted my money sooner. He had mapped out my murder with the patience of a surgeon and the precision of a general. He had forged my name. He had studied my heart, my prescriptions, my vulnerabilities. He had carried a vial into that restaurant and chosen the moment carefully, waiting for distraction, for laughter, for trust. Then he smiled at me as he handed me death in a glass. And I realized then that something inside me had gone silent. No grief, no pain, no echo of the boy I used to know. It was as if that child, the one who once clutched a toy car and laughed in the passenger seat of my first truck, had never existed at all. He was gone, and in his place stood a stranger wearing my son's face. I thought of Margaret, her warning whispers by the window, the sadness in her eyes when she told me he saw me as a bank, not a father. She had known. God help me, she had known. I had clung to hope, blinded myself with excuses, telling myself he would grow, he would change, he would find his way. But she had been right. That boy had grown all right, into something darker, colder, hollowed of humanity. Any bond between us, any flicker of fatherly love, burned to ash in that moment. The cord that tied us was severed, clean and final. He wasn't my son. He was my enemy. And I could feel the difference immediately. The weight I had carried, hope, grief, hesitation, slipped off my shoulders. In its place was something sharper, purpose, the kind of cold, hard clarity I had once used to build an empire from nothing, the kind of clarity that leaves no room for mercy. I stood by the window, staring out at the city as the lights of evening flickered on, one by one. Somewhere out there, Daniel and Laura were smiling, planning, waiting for the prize they believed was almost theirs. They thought they had time. They thought I was weak. They thought the game was over. But they were wrong. The investigators had given me every piece I needed. Eleanor had given me the plan. Now it was my turn. I would give Daniel exactly what he craved: safety, reassurance, the illusion that his trap had nearly worked. I would let him believe the prize was within reach. I would feed his greed until it blinded him completely. And then, when the moment was right, I would take everything from him. Not with poison, not with rage, but with truth, the kind that destroys. The decision was made. The only question left was how to deliver the blow. Eleanor and I sat across from one another in her office. The city spread beneath us like a chessboard. She had already mapped out the moves with the precision of someone who understood that winning wasn't about speed, but about inevitability. "We need a stage," she said, her voice calm, controlled. "A setting where they'll feel secure, where their guard will drop, somewhere they'll believe the prize is waiting." "And then?" I asked. She folded her hands on the desk. "Then we dismantle them, piece by piece, methodical, irrefutable. You let me handle the law. You focus on the role you'll play." The grieving father, the weary old man, the patriarch who wanted nothing more than to ensure his family's comfort. I had already rehearsed it in every conversation with Daniel, the pauses, the frailty, the weariness. It came naturally now, a mask so convincing even he couldn't see the truth behind it. Eleanor pulled a folder toward her, thick with documents. "We'll call it the signing of the Hale Family Trust. You'll invite them, smiling, telling them it's a formality. They'll come dressed for victory, expecting to walk out with the world in their hands. And instead? I asked. And instead, she said with a sharp glint in her eyes, they'll be confronted with every crime, every debt, every betrayal laid bare in black and white. No theatrics, no denials, just evidence stacked so high it drowns them. She laid out the plan in careful steps. The conference room would be prepared, long table, neat stack of blue folders, each one filled with a piece of their downfall. Toxicology report, financial records, transcripts of Laura's calls to the galleries, the forged medical power of attorney, the internet searches, every ugly truth bound in waiting. They'll sit across from you expecting to sign for their future, she said. Instead, they'll be signing away everything. I looked out the window at the city, at the cars glinting like insects on the streets below. It felt almost surreal. For years I had thought my battles were over. I had survived the grind of business, the loss of Margaret, the long nights of building something from nothing. I thought I was done fighting. But this was the war I had never prepared for, the war inside my own bloodline. And yet I felt steady, cold, ready. Set the meeting, I told her. Eleanor nodded once, her expression unreadable, but her eyes alive with fire. I'll arrange it. Tuesday, 10 a.m. They'll walk in thinking it's the beginning of their empire. They'll walk out with nothing. I stood, straightening my coat. No, I said softly. They'll walk out knowing exactly who they are. The trap was set. All that remained was to watch them step into it. Tuesday morning came with skies so clear they looked painted. I arrived at Eleanor's building early, walking through the lobby with the quiet steps of a man carrying a secret too heavy for the world to hear. The receptionist greeted me with her usual polite smile, unaware that today would decide the fate of my bloodline. The conference room was ready. Eleanor had prepared it with surgical precision. A long mahogany table stretched across the center, its surface polished to a mirror sheen. At one end, a neat stack of blue folders waited, each one a weapon sharper than steel. The blinds were half drawn, muting the sunlight, giving the room a solemn glow. It looked less like a boardroom and more like a courtroom. I took my seat at the head of the table. My cane rested against the arm of the chair, a prop for the role I would play. Frailty, weariness, the mask of an old man desperate to secure his legacy. At exactly 10 o'clock, the double doors swung open. Daniel entered first, his steps quick, his smile wide. He wore a tailored suit far too expensive or someone drowning in debt, the kind of suit meant to scream success even when his pockets were empty. Laura followed close behind, draped in a silk dress that shimmered in the dim light. Diamonds glittered at her ears and neck, borrowed perhaps, but meant to impress. They looked like a royal couple striding into their coronation. "Dad," Daniel said, crossing the room with open arms. "You look good, better than I expected." His eyes flickered over me, scanning for weakness, for confirmation that the attempt at the restaurant had left its mark. "I've been resting," I said, letting my voice rasp with deliberate fatigue. "Doctors tell me to take it slow. That's part of why we're here today." Laura leaned forward, her smile sweet as honey. "We were so worried, but seeing you here, well, it's a relief. And this trust business, it's the right call. You shouldn't have to worry about a thing." Her words were smooth, but I saw the flicker in her eyes as they darted toward the folders on the table. Anticipation. Hunger. She was already imagining what lay inside. Eleanor entered then, carrying a leather briefcase. Her expression was neutral, professional, but I knew the fire behind her composure. She placed the case on the table, opened it, and began arranging papers with deliberate care. "Mr. Hale," she said formally, though her eyes flicked to me with the faintest glimmer of understanding. "Shall we begin?" Daniel and Laura exchanged a glance, excitement sparking between them. They believed they were moments away from victory. They believed the world was about to shift into their hands. I folded my hands on the table and let a small, weary smile touch my lips. "Yes," I said softly. "Let's begin." The stage was set, the audience unsuspecting, the curtain about to rise. The silence in the conference room was thick, humming with anticipation. Daniel leaned back in his chair, a smug smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, while Laura adjusted her silk dress and folded her manicured hands neatly on the table. They were ready for signatures, for promises, for wealth. What they weren't ready for was the truth. Eleanor opened the first blue folder and slid it across the polished surface toward them. "Before we proceed with the trust," she began, her tone calm but razor-sharp, "Mr. Hale asked that I review some documents with you both. Formalities, you understand. Transparency." Daniel's grin widened. "Of course. Whatever makes him comfortable." Laura nodded quickly, her earrings catching the light. "We understand completely." Eleanor tapped the folder with one manicured nail. "This is a toxicology report. It analyzes the contents of a napkin taken from a dinner you attended with Mr. Hale last week." The smile slipped from Daniel's face. Laura's eyes flickered to him, searching. "The lab found a concentration of metoprolol tartrate," Eleanor continued, "enough to induce acute cardiac arrest in an otherwise healthy man. Enough to kill Mr. Hale and make it look natural. Would you like me to read the rest?" Daniel laughed, too loudly, too quickly. "This is absurd. Anyone could have tampered with that." Eleanor didn't flinch. She opened another folder and placed it neatly on top of the first. "This is a record of your debts. $3.1 million spread across mortgages, loans, and credit cards. Every payment missed, every repossession notice documented. You're insolvent, Daniel. Broke. Drowning." Laura shifted in her seat, her composure faltering. Eleanor opened another folder, her movements deliberate. "These are transcripts of phone calls Laura made to art galleries, offering to sell Margaret Hale's private collection, claiming her father-in-law was on his way out. Photographs of the paintings were provided. Metadata confirms they were taken inside this very house." Laura's face paled. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. "And this," Eleanor said, sliding yet another folder across, "is a forged medical power of attorney, filed 3 months ago, giving Daniel full control over Richard Hale's medical care. The signature, of course, is fake, but the access it granted was real. Records show you reviewed his prescriptions, his heart condition, and the exact medications that would kill him without raising suspicion. The room was silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioning." Daniel's face had gone rigid, his jaw clenched, his eyes darting between me and Eleanor. "You planned it meticulously," Eleanor said, her voice almost gentle now. "The poison, the cover story, the inheritance. But you underestimated one thing." She leaned forward, her gaze pinning Daniel to his chair. "You underestimated the man sitting at the head of this table." I watched my son then, not as a father, but as a man seeing his adversary exposed. The arrogance was gone. In its place was fear. And for the first time in years, I felt the weight shift back into my hands. Daniel tried to speak, but his voice cracked, thin and brittle. "Dad, you don't believe this, do you? These are lies, fabrications. Eleanor's trying to twist everything." "Enough," I said, my voice low, steady. The word cut through the room like a blade. He froze, his mouth still open, his excuses dying in his throat. Laura reached for his hand under the table, but he didn't take it. His eyes stayed locked on me, wide and searching, as if he might still find a trace of mercy. "There will be no trial," I said, leaning forward. "No headlines, no police. I will not drag Margaret's name through the mud because of you. But make no mistake, Daniel, you are finished. Both of you." Eleanor opened one final folder and slid a document toward them. The first page bore their names, printed neatly at the top. "Assignment and forfeiture agreement. This," she said, "strips you of any claim to the Hale estate. The trust you thought you'd inherit? Gone. The house you live in? Signed over. Every last shred of protection Richard provided you. Revoked. Effective immediately." Laura's face drained of color. "You can't do this," she whispered. "I can," I said quietly. "And I have." Daniel slammed a hand on the table, the sharp sound echoing. "You're bluffing. You wouldn't dare." "Bluff?" I interrupted. I slid the toxicology report closer to him, the black and white proof of his betrayal staring back at him. "Do you want me to call the police right now? Do you want me to send this to the DA? You think the judge will care about your debts, your excuses, your crocodile tears?" The silence that followed was suffocating. Eleanor pushed a pen across the table. "Sign, or face prison," she said, sighing. "Apply." Laura was the first to break. Her hand shook as she picked up the pen. She scribbled her name across the line, her diamond bracelet jingling faintly, sounding suddenly hollow. Daniel sat rigid, his eyes flickering between me, Eleanor, and the stack of folders that contained his sins. His jaw worked, grinding against the truth. Finally, with a trembling hand, he signed. The sound of the pen scratching paper was the final severing of whatever thread had bound us. Eleanor gathered the documents, her face unreadable, but her eyes sharp with triumph. She slipped them into her briefcase and closed it with a click that echoed like the closing of a cell door. Daniel slumped back in his chair, his shoulders sagging. Laura stared down at her lap, unable to meet my eyes. I rose slowly, leaning on my cane. "You wanted my life," I said softly. "Instead, you've lost yours." I turned and walked out, leaving them behind in the silence they had earned. 3 months passed. Seasons shifted, the sharp bite of winter giving way to the first whispers of spring. In those weeks, I spoke to no one about what had transpired in that conference room. Daniel and Laura vanished from my life as though they had never existed, their names left behind in the pile of forfeiture documents Eleanor kept locked away. I did not check on them, did not follow their descent. Whatever pit they had dug for themselves, they could live in it. They no longer concerned me. My concern was Margaret, her memory, her legacy. On a quiet morning in March, I stood before the doors of the Margaret Hale Foundation. The sign gleamed in brushed bronze, her name catching the sunlight. Inside, the air smelled faintly of fresh paint and polished wood, clean but warm. The lobby walls displayed framed photographs of Margaret, her with a paintbrush in hand, her laughing at a gallery opening, her standing with me in front of the first truck that started it all. This place wasn't built for profit or for show. It was built for her, and for what she believed in. The foundation had 2 wings. The first was dedicated to supporting young artists who couldn't afford the luxury of expression. Margaret used to say art was oxygen for the soul, and too many were suffocating without it. The second wing funded animal sanctuaries. She had always had a soft spot for strays, for the creatures others cast aside. Our home was never without a dog curled by the fire or a cat perched on the windowsill. As I walked through the main gallery, I saw easels lined up, each one holding canvases painted by students whose names would one day matter. The colors leapt off the walls, vivid reds, defiant blues, tender pastels. I paused at one piece, a chaotic swirl of shapes that reminded me of Margaret's recovery painting, the one she had clutched with trembling hands after beating cancer the first time. A young woman approached, no older than 20. Her hair was tied back with a paint-stained scarf, her hands still smudged with charcoal. "Mr. Hale?" she asked nervously. I turned. "Yes?" "I just wanted to thank you," she said, her voice earnest. "Without the foundation, I couldn't afford classes. I was ready to give up, but now—" She gestured to her painting, her eyes shining. "Now I feel like I can breathe again." Her words pierced me, not with pain, but with something gentler. For the first time in years, I felt a kind of peace settle into my bones. Margaret's name would not be sold, not be desecrated, not be turned into currency for greed. It would live here, in color and light, in every life this foundation touched. And for the first time since that poisoned glass sat in front of me, I no longer felt like a man betrayed. I felt like a man who had reclaimed purpose. When I first sat down in that restaurant, I believed legacy was measured in money. $62 million, a company built from nothing, decades of sacrifice carved into a single number. That's what I thought I was leaving behind. But I was wrong. Legacy isn't measured in dollars. It's measured in what remains when betrayal has burned everything else away. Daniel and Laura tried to take everything from me, my life, my name, even Margaret's memory. They believed money was the crown jewel of existence, that comfort could be bought with blood. But in trying to kill me, they revealed the truth I had been too blind to see, that love without loyalty is hollow, and family without honor is nothing more than strangers sharing a name. I could have sent them to prison. I could have dragged our family through the tabloids, watched them rot under the weight of public shame. But what would that have achieved? Justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes justice is about reclamation, about making sure the greedy never get what they crave, and the pure never lose what they deserve. That's why I built the Margaret Hale Foundation, because Margaret's name deserved more than whispers of scandal. It deserved to live in halls filled with color and light, in the laughter of young artists, in the safety of animals she would have cradled in her arms. She believed that beauty had the power to save, even in the darkest times. Now that belief will outlive both of us. When I walk through those galleries, I don't see the faces of betrayal anymore. I see hope. I see second chances. I see the proof that even poison can be turned into paint, that even treachery can be transformed into something that heals. And yet, the scars remain. I will never forget the weight of that glass in my hand, The way Samuel's whisper shattered the world I thought I knew. I will never forget looking into my son's eyes and realizing there was no son left to see. Betrayal leaves a mark deeper than any wound, one that doesn't close, but it also leaves behind something else: clarity. My clarity is this: a man's true wealth isn't what he leaves in a will. It's what he builds in the hearts of others. It's the love he protects, the memories he honors, the futures he shapes. Daniel tried to erase me for money, but what I leave behind can't be spent, sold, or stolen. So if you're listening now, ask yourself, what will your legacy be? Will it be numbers on a page, fleeting and fragile? Or will it be something greater, something no betrayal can touch? If my story moved you, I ask one thing: subscribe to this channel, share this story, and tell me in the comments what legacy means to you. Because in the end, our stories only live as long as we dare to tell them